All right, welcome back, everybody. In this section, we're going to see how Kierkegaard tries to set up his philosophical position in relation to some of the other famous philosophers of his time. So Hegel's system is what looms large in the background for your reading from the Problemata today. That makes it really hard for us to just grasp what he means in this reading, unless you're a Hegel scholar or have this intimate familiarity with Hegel that most of Kierkegaard would have presumed his contemporary intellectuals would have already had. For example, I'm just curious what the heck people thought of a passage like this. As soon as the single individual wants to assert himself in particularity, in direct opposition to the universal, he sins. And only by recognizing this can he again reconcile himself with the universal. Whenever, having entered the universal, the single individual feels an urge to assert his particularity, he is in a state of temptation. This talk of single individual, particularity and particular, and versus universal, these are all technical terms that Kierkegaard is using. What I'm hoping is I can explain to you a little bit how Hegel's philosophy works, and that's actually going to give you a really rich and deep, even deeper understanding of what Kierkegaard's view really comes to. Okay, so the first thing you have to know about Hegel's system is Hegel has this division between the aesthetic, which is sort of like we think of aesthetic as another term for art, but really the meaning goes back to the senses and sensuality and passion, because what art does, art objects sort of engage our senses, like paintings engage our visual enjoyment, and music engages our auditory pleasures, and that's what the root of aesthetic goes to. So if you're just engaged in the whirl of passion, following your desires left and right, that's sort of the lower life form. That's like sort of being animalistic almost. That's the aesthetic, just being guided by your feelings. Whereas for Hegel, the ethical, what we have to do as individuals, and in Hegel's view, Hegel has this grand enlightenment project where he thinks the progress of human civilization is, one civilization succeeds another and has more and more progress toward reason. And so as civilizations become more ethical, and as individuals actually become ethical, and they don't just care about their passions, but they're willing to stifle their passions for the good of the community or for some higher duty, then they're in this new realm, this new sphere of the ethical. And so particularity and caring about yourself as an individual is one thing. Caring about society and the universal good is something else. And so this is one bit of background that maybe can give you a slightly better understanding of what Kierkegaard is saying. As soon as the single individual asserts himself in particularity, that's in opposition to the universal. You see, this is the individual privileging their own particular desires. Then that's just a state of sin. Only by recognizing this can you actually reconcile with the universal and reconcile with society, and according to Hegel, reconcile yourself with God as well. So religion is up here with reason and the ethical, according to Hegel. Whenever, having entered the universal, the single individual feels the urge to assert his particularity, he's in a state of temptation. Like maybe you've gotten to the point where you care about society and you're not just a selfish individual anymore. If you then feel the pull to just privilege yourself, then that's like that is just temptation. To return to this is just the state of sin in Hegel's system. There's a couple of other important terms I'll just give you. This concept of mediation is one that Kierkegaard returns to over and over again in this section. And this is another term that goes with this ethical realm. So mediation is not down here in the aesthetic lower immediacy realm. Mediation is here in the ethical realm. Because besides sort of universal good and caring about society, the word universal also means like the meanings of words, like the universal concepts. Like when we talk about the concept of horse, not just a particular horse, but the concept of the horse is something higher and more abstract. And mediation is what our concepts allow us to do when we understand the world. So knowledge is gained by having universals. Mediation, it has a logical role in Hegel's system. So Hegel talks a lot about logical arguments, and in sort of maybe fascinating ways, reality sort of mirrors this logical structure. So Hegel thinks this classic syllogistic argument that you might have heard before, Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. The middle term in this, human, is both a universal concept of being human, and it mediates between these two premises and allows us to actually make an inference and come to have knowledge about Socrates being mortal. So the mediating term here allows us to build knowledge, it allows us to attain understanding, and all of these things, both mediation and the universal, have to do with communication and with rational inference. Like this inference, you can come to rationally believe that Socrates is mortal on the basis of these things. So these concepts of understanding and reason are all linked here and have a really important role in Hegel's system. One other concept that you just might have heard from Hegel, and it's important to be aware of it. Hegel talks about dialectic and this progress of civilizations that I was speaking of, which attains more and more toward the reason structuring society. Hegel thinks it goes by this dialectical process where you have one thing, which he calls the thesis, and then there's a negation of that, the antithesis. And then somehow, in order to make the next step in progress, what we have to do is we have to bring them together in a kind of synthesis. And some of our concepts actually are these concepts got by synthesis of more basic ones. Like in some ways, the concept of becoming really is like mashing together being and nothing, and you get to some concept of becoming. Okay, I won't speak too much about Hegelian dialectic, but that's another thing in the background. So this realm of the ethical is the realm of society. This is what we talked about before with the concept of the tragic hero and the social good, because the social, what's good for society and the universal can easily conflict with what's good for you as an individual. Remember when we talked about two versions of the trolley problem, where what you should do is pull the lever in order to sacrifice the one to save the five. That's like the ethically objective good thing to do. But what if this is your friend or your parent or your child? Then you might be in a deep state of temptation because you in your particularity might think, no, I love this person. I care about this person. I don't even know these five people. And if you feel that pull, you're being led by your individualistic desires and you're privileging your friends. Of course, these five people have friends too. So what's so special about you and your friend? If you're willing to assert yourself and save the one and sacrifice the society, you're giving up on the social goods. You're sinning against the social good and against the religious order too. If as in Hegel's system, religion is identified with reason and the ethical. Now, what's fundamentally different for Kierkegaard? So this is one big picture of, again, this is a theistic picture. This is not Kierkegaard arguing with his atheistic counterparts. This is what he takes to be his main competitor, because Hegel was the main philosopher of the day and was also promulgating a kind of Christianity. But Kierkegaard thinks this is all completely wrong. If that is just all religion comes to, then we might as well just be atheists and join the Greek philosophers. Religion for Kierkegaard has to be something fundamentally different than just rational philosophy. And when Kierkegaard talks about the single individual, then this is like Kierkegaardian speak for the one who's actually going to attain a higher state of immediacy. When you have to travel through the ethical for Kierkegaard, you have to understand this. If you just didn't even understand the ethical, you would be stuck down here in the realm of lower immediacy. So for Kierkegaard, you have to travel from the aesthetic to the ethical, but then you have to transcend the ethical and come to the individual again without just returning down to the lower immediacy. So Kierkegaard, in positing his conception of religion and the night of faith and the single individual, that is him trying to create a whole new category that simply isn't possible to exist within Hegel's system. Now, one of the easiest ways to try to illustrate this and communicate this to Kierkegaard's audience is by contrasting a figure like Abraham or the Knight of Faith with the tragic hero. And that's why this makes such a great foil for Kierkegaard and why he talks a bunch about the tragic hero in this reading. Because remember what the tragic hero does. The tragic hero feels the pull of two different goods, sort of duty to one's family or one's parents or daughters, and duty to the state, or duty to one's individual love versus duty to one's family or some other higher good. So when the tragic hero makes one of these tough decisions, their decision is still coherent, it's rationalizable. Like, remember Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia for the better good of Greek society. Now, we would feel tears for them. So Kierkegaard says the tragic hero, he needs tears, and he claims them. Like, Agamemnon deserves our tears because he was given this tough lot in life. But nonetheless, he did the right thing. We completely understand him. He is within the ethical. His concepts, his actions are perfectly well mediated by decisions and reasons that we can fully understand. So that's why the tragic hero, even though Abraham might seem like a tragic figure, on Kierkegaard's way of thinking, Abraham's decision is nothing like the decision for the tragic hero. Instead, Kierkegaard says, if you treated Abraham like that and just wept for him, you are completely confused. Abraham actually doesn't need our tears and doesn't deserve them. His situation is just completely different than that of the tragic hero. So let me return to this map that I gave you once before, where I was talking about the relationship between Abraham and the ethical, and through this double movement, the movement of resignation and the movement of faith. And again, we talked before about how according to ethical concepts, what Abraham really is doing is murder. And so in some sense, that talk about returning to lower immediacy, see, if we're willing to do this act of murder, then Abraham really is just privileging his own particular situation and not doing the thing that the universal demands. Okay, so look, here's another idea that captures this. So Abraham is therefore no instance the tragic hero, but something quite different. He is either a murderer or a man of faith. So we can't make sense of Abraham as a tragic hero. He really is going to just, if we're stuck with these ethical concepts like Hegelian philosophy, we can make no other sense of him except as being a murderer. We cannot make sense of him as being the father of faith. If we really want to make sense of Abraham as the father of faith, then Kierkegaard says we just have to ditch Hegel's philosophy entirely and come up with this new understanding of faith. That's what Kierkegaard is really attempting to do. Okay. So I'll say this, that Kierkegaard in some ways takes over some aspects of Hegel. So Kierkegaard, in some other works, he talks about these three domains of our lives: the aesthetic, or the lower immediacy, the world of personal feelings. Then from that, there is the ethical, and this is sort of him taking over Hegel. And then Kierkegaard again posits the idea that somehow, paradoxically, you can still be an individual, you can be an immediacy, but without returning to lower immediacy. There can somehow be this third category of higher immediacy. So these three spheres and how you can actually navigate them to arrive at the realm of faith is really what Kierkegaard is trying to depict for us in this reading. So if you understand why the tragic hero is so fundamentally different than Abraham and Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith, then you will have got one of the key concepts here. And in many ways, Kierkegaard really is negative about his philosophical contemporaries and thinks they can't possibly explain the truth or the import of Christianity. So let me just return to this idea one more time. So Kierkegaard says, like, if the ethical life is the highest thing and there's nothing incommensurable, completely special and spiritual left over, then what else can we make of it about except the sense in which Abraham is engaging in an act of evil? Because the single individual who is to be expressed in the universal, if that's the case, then no one needs other categories than those of the Greek philosophers. This is Kierkegaard saying the thing that I think is really critical to understanding his view, is if he had to give up his conception of Christianity, he wouldn't take Descartes or Hegel's as a backup. He would say, no, then the Greek philosophers are right. We should just abandon this business about Christianity. Existentialism is difficult because we feel the pull of both of these. And if we lost what he thinks really is the essential particular temporal aspect of Christianity, then that's just like saying the philosophers are right. And we should just give up on Abraham. Abraham shouldn't even be our model anymore. We should look for some secular ones or something like that. So this is another way of understanding exactly why Kierkegaard says that the highest condition is the Knight of Faith, and why that is fundamentally absurd or paradoxical. So before, we talked about this paradox as being the idea that the Knight of Faith holds together the temporal and the eternal, or holds together all these other these opposing concepts like necessity and contingency, or the finite and the infinite. Well, now we can sort of see that Kierkegaard really thinks there's a philosophical grounding for this. This is sort of the philosophical way of unpacking the paradox. See, it's paradoxical that there could be a single individual which is higher than the universal, because if you are going to assert yourself and your individuality, isn't that just returning down to the lower immediacy? to think that there could be some higher individuality just doesn't fundamentally make sense. There's something ridiculous about it. That's the whole concept of the universal, is that it is the general thing that is privileged above the particular. So this concept of the single individual in Kierkegaard's sense is simply inverting or making nonsense of these philosophical concepts. So that really is what Kierkegaard thinks his view entails. Okay. Just one other theme that this connects up with, and this talk about absurdity, is this talk of mediation. So Kierkegaard says things like, this position, the night of faith, cannot be mediated. All mediation occurs precisely by virtue of the universal. So in some ways, Abraham is beyond rational inference. He's beyond the kind of mediation that occurs in those syllogistic inferences. And this is also tied to the idea, since we can't understand fundamentally Abraham's reasons, we really can't make sense of him at his actions. Understanding another person has to do with comprehending their reasons and understanding why the things they do would be reasonable from their perspective. But if Abraham is totally beyond mediation, this ties in with Kierkegaard's theme that he's beyond even our understanding in a complete way. Okay, so what I'm hoping you get out of this is the sense that we can come to an even richer conception of what Kierkegaard means by the night of faith, and this peculiar position, this absurd or paradoxical existential position Kierkegaard thinks is the highest form of life for us, by seeing how Kierkegaard really thinks this can be situated within the philosophical concepts of his time, namely Hegel's, but how it defies them. And if we actually want to get to the truth of Christianity, then Hegel's going to be no good. Okay, thanks.